Good morning. Our thought for the week. I'm going to venture out in the next number of weeks and focus on the issue of anxiety. And I know that for some of you, you saw the thought for the days, and we wrapped that up in Philippians. And Philippians 4 has a couple of verses that deal with anxiety. And so there'll be some themes here that are similar, but we're going to take a deep dive on this issue in a technologically driven culture that is fast-paced, with a lot being thrown at us by way of worldview, with a lot of news stories, with a lot of tragedy that is set before our eyes, whether visually or whether we're reading about it. We just have with the information overload and pace, our lives are so fast that anxiety is literally running rampant in our world. So many people, lots of young people struggling with anxiety. And I want to address it, I want to talk about it, I want to think about it over the next number of weeks, because there's a lot to say about it. And I actually think when we're done, this sort of set of thought for the weeks could really be a little bit of something that you might be able to go back to online and revisit if you find yourself swirling, caught up in the midst of anxiety in some daunting ways. I read a book this summer called A Still and Quiet Mind by a biblical counselor named Esther Smith. Can't recommend it highly enough. It's a great book, a real model of how a good biblical counseling book should be written. And she gives some real practical steps specifically for dealing with, not so much, it is to do with anxiety, but she's actually very specific in dealing with unwanted thoughts. And that often is either stems from having anxiety, or sometimes they can produce anxiety. And there's a great correspondence that exists between our thought life and our wrestling with anxiety. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of that. So first, in this thought for the week, I want to begin thinking about how we deal with our anxious thoughts. How do we deal with them? There's a number of things we can do, and some of this might depend upon the nature of the thought itself. So let me give you the first thing that we need to do. The first thing we need to do with a number of thoughts, not all thoughts, but a number of thoughts, is we need to learn to dismiss them. Oftentimes, anxiety is produced when an unwanted thought comes into our minds, and we think, why am I thinking that? Where did that come from? And we begin to turn it over, and we begin to feel maybe guilty about it. We feel fearful. Are we losing our mind? Why would I think that? We might get into a loop, and we can't get out of that thought pattern, and it keeps cycling through, and we feel like we can't get the needle, as it were, off of the record. So the first thing we need to do is learn to dismiss our thoughts. Now, as you learn to dismiss your thoughts, and you don't want to do this with all thoughts, there are thoughts that you do need to think about. There are things that are worth pondering, but there are also things that are simply fear-inducing. Note, you can dismiss them in part because not every thought that comes into your mind comes from you. So sometimes we have thoughts sort of sown in our minds from maybe things subconsciously we took in a long time ago. Perhaps we have things that pop into our heads from fears that we've long held. Perhaps the devil even is in some way provoking and stirring us to then snap a thought in some way that we think, and in response to promptings to recollect particular things. And what we want to do is learn that not every thought is worth turning over and dwelling on, and we need to dismiss them. I read one therapist who said, and I kind of like this approach, it may sound corny, but I think it's helpful. She talked about what she called purple dooring your thought. And here's what she meant by it. If you see a purple door, you don't dwell on a purple door. You don't turn it over and over again. You don't go, oh my, I can't believe the purple door. You're not obsessed with the purple door. It's just a door. It's just purple. And so what happens is you think, well, oh, that's interesting. It's a purple door. And then you go on about your day. You just don't give weight to it. So remember this. You're not in control of everything that pops into your head, but you are in control of the airtime you choose to give the thought that pops in your head. So you need to learn to dismiss thoughts. Sometimes they're anxious thoughts. Sometimes they're lustful thoughts. Sometimes they're angry thoughts. Sometimes they're vengeful thoughts. Sometimes they're self-deprecating thoughts. Sometimes they're all kinds of things. But you got to learn to be able to dismiss them. Secondly, sometimes you get into loops and you can't just dismiss them, or you're having a hard time dismissing it, or the thought itself is stirred by circumstances around you that keep recycling themselves, and so you can't unattend to it in particular ways. So I want to give you a second thing to do that's deeply biblical. And when I say this, you'll go, well, of course, Pastor Bryan, that's what we should do. But you got to see what keeps us from it. So the second thing that we need to do, first, some things need to be dismissed. Secondly, we need to learn to cast. Throw it somewhere. Not away, but throw it a particular direction. Now, what do I mean by throwing it a particular direction? I mean it very specifically. We need to learn to cast, as the Bible says, our cares or our anxieties on the Lord. 1 Peter 5, 6 and 7. Listen to it. Humble yourselves, therefore. Now, this is the reason why we struggle with this. Because anxious habits tend to be a bit of a diagnosis of a twisted form of pride. How is that? Because an anxious heart is a perseverating heart upon the condition, fear, circumstance, situation, regrets, apprehensions, insecurities of the self. So I'm navel gazing, as they say. I'm looking at myself, right? And I'm going, I just got to think more about myself. I got to think more about this situation. And you turn it. And it's not that you feel arrogant. That's a kind of expression of pride. But instead, you end up becoming self-consumed by your thoughts instead of being able to get them out. We'll talk more in future thoughts for the week about getting them out. But for now, I want you to think about casting them on. And pride will keep you thinking, turning, looking at yourself, instead of saying, wait a minute, I can't resolve this. I have to acknowledge that I am not able to deal with the present situation as constituted in my own mind. And so what I need to do is humble myself. Humble yourselves, therefore, 1 Peter 5, 6, under the mighty hand of God. Why? So that at the proper time he may exalt you. He'll take care of you at the proper time. Don't worry about yourself. Turn the thought to him, and then you cast all your anxieties, your cares, the weight on him, because he cares for you. Now, the reason you cast it that direction is because he has a disposition toward you. So, the two pieces that sit before you're able to really cast that is, one, you have to say, I need him, and I am not able to do this myself. You've got to stamp down pride and deal with pride. Secondly, then, you have to look and say, what are his affections for me? How is he toward me? Knowing that he now is loving, knowing that he cares for me, knowing that he longs for my burden to be light in that sense, and me not to be taxed by lawful thoughts, by fearful thoughts, by anxious thoughts, and so forth. I can turn, as it were, and throw my thoughts upon him and his good character. Now, we're going to continue this next week. We're going to think more and a little deeper about some other strategies for dealing with anxious thoughts. So far, two simple ones. Not every thought that comes in your mind is from you. Dismiss. Sometimes there are things that weigh heavy, things around you are turning, you get in the loop, you're struggling to get out. You've got to learn first to cast. Now there's more coming. These are not the only two, but I want you just to begin to try to practice these a little bit. I want you to begin by purple dooring some things that come into your head that are insignificant, weigh you down, and by casting in prayer those things and leaving them, and walking into something else. More to come. May the Lord bless you, and may the Lord begin to really help us in this frenetic culture with our anxious thoughts. Take care.